Midway is tremendously important, but really within the broader context of the Pacific War as a whole, I would argue that even in 1942, it's the Guadalcanal campaign that is more decisive. That a lot of Americans see Pearl Harbor and Midway as sort of the bookends, and that, oh, Midway, done, right? We've turned the tide at this point. And the truth is that Midway in and of itself doesn't win the war. It doesn't even really set the war on a new trajectory.
Hello and welcome to another episode of History Undone Myth-Busting. I'm James Hanson. Every episode we're going to choose a different moment in history or an historical figure, and I'll sit down with one of our experts to talk through some of the most common things that people get wrong. We'll also cover one or two things you might not know. Today, once again, we're back discussing a critical moment in US World War II history, the Battle of Midway. And who else could we possibly have to join us? And the author of Shattered Sword, the great Jonathan Parshall. John, welcome back.
Nice to be here with you again.
Now, you've obviously done a lot of writing on Midway myths before. Why do you think there are so many? Is it just because it's such a famous moment in US history that it comes with the territory?
Yeah, I do. This is one of the five most important battles in American military history, I would argue. And it's a big, sprawling, complex battle. And the scholarship has continued to evolve over the past 80 years. So to my mind, it's not surprising that there would still be a lot of misconceptions kind of sitting out there.
Yeah, and it's worth mentioning you've written a brilliant book with Anthony Tully, your colleague. You use a lot of Japanese source material.
Correct.
Do you think that's helped the two of you get to the truth of what happened that much better?
As an historian, I would be careful about using getting to the truth. Every new book, I hope, moves the ball forward and gets us to a closer approximation to the truth. But I'm quite certain that there will be future books that will revise what we've written. In any case, your original point, though, yeah, using the Japanese sources was absolutely crucial to redefining some of these myths that had been out there for really about 60 years when we wrote the book.
Well, let's get into your first of 5 myths about Midway. And this is the claim that without the Doolittle raid, there would be no Battle of Midway. Now, first of all, just remind us what the Doolittle raid was, and then talk a bit about how it's linked or not linked, as the case may be, to Midway.
Yeah, so the Doolittle raid happens in the middle of April 18th. There's a pair of American carriers that race in close to Japan. They launch a brace of 16 medium bombers, and they go off and bomb Tokyo and Yokohama and some other places. And that's a real startling development for the Japanese. They were not expecting that at all. And it's completely mortifying for their military. And the myth has always been that because of the Doolittle raid, that is what put the colonel into Admiral Yamamoto's head, the head of Combined Fleet, that I have to fight this battle at Midway. There's a reversal of causality there, though, in the myth. In actuality, Yamamoto had been planning this operation for months, and he had already won the bureaucratic battle against his bosses at Naval GHQ up in Tokyo. On April 4th and 5th, he had already gotten the okie dokie to go ahead and do this operation. So it's clear that, the fact that Doolittle happens 2 weeks later means that, this was already on the drawing board. What Doolittle does, though, is it changes the mind of the Imperial Japanese Army, which is important because up to this point, the Army is like, we have no interest in this Midway operation. We're not going to supply any troops to help you invade this island because we know, Yamamoto, that what you're really trying to do here is get a foothold in the Hawaiian island chain, and then you're going to try to move down that chain, and you're going to try to invade Oahu now, aren't you? And we don't want to do that. But when Doolittle goes down and the emperor is in danger as a result of this raid, there are bombers flying around really close to the imperial palace. The army now does a complete about face, and they're like, yeah, maybe sinking those carriers is more important than we thought. And so, by the way, here's a regiment of troops that you can take along with you on this operation to help invade Midway. And not only that, but we're going to cut orders now for 2 divisions to start doing amphibious training for an invasion of Oahu. So, in that sense, at least, Doolittle is very important in terms of sort of rejiggering the internal military political landscape within the Japan.
That's fascinating. So you can kind of understand where the myth comes from, because even though the Japanese had already decided to attack Midway, what happened with the Doolittle raid kind of confirmed their logic for doing it.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
Okay, let's move on to Midway myth number 2. And you've chosen, well, quite a controversial one, I suppose, which is the sense that the US triumphed against all odds, that it was a stunning victory against the odds, a kind of a massive upset at the Battle of Midway. Why is that a myth, John?
So if you look at the titles of the 2 most popular books that had come out before ours, Miracle at Midway, An Incredible Victory, that gives you a sense right there of what people judge the odds as looking like. At one level, if we look at the number of Japanese warships that are running around in the Pacific that morning on 4 June doing something somewhere, yes, the Japanese had many more warships than we had. But if you start peeling away all of the invasion force up in the Aleutian Islands, which is 1,500 miles away, the carrier force that's up there, the battleship support force that's up there, then the main body that's 600 miles behind Nagumo, the invasion force, the invasion support force, the oiler force, the blah, 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 blah forces, peel all that stuff away. At the tip of the spear, on the morning of 4 June, the only 2 forces that are actually going to be in direct contact with each other are Nagumo's carrier force, which is 20 warships, 4 aircraft carriers, and about 250 planes, versus 3 American carriers, an unsinkable airfield, more than 300 aircraft on the American side. So you can kind of see that those forces are actually fairly evenly matched, and that's one of the reasons that the battle kind of goes back and forth throughout the early mornings in the morning, because it is very evenly balanced. And so that's one of the things that Tony and I were trying to do in the book, is sort of re-clarify that and say, let's just cut away all the chaff here and just talk about the people that are actually in combat.
Is it also, do you think part of the myth, John, comes from the fact that because in a lot of people's minds, Midway is associated with what happened 6 months earlier at Pearl Harbor, that you've got Pearl Harbor with the destruction or the partial destruction of the US fleet, and so therefore people think Midway is kind of the flip side of the coin, and so they over-dramatize Midway in the same way that maybe arguably people over-dramatize Pearl Harbor?
I think that's a great point. Actually, that one of the things we're trying to do within the context of the book is saying Midway is tremendously important, but really within the broader context of the Pacific War as a whole, I would argue that even in 1942, it's the Guadalcanal campaign that is more decisive, okay? Which is, a weird thing for an author to say about the battle about which he's writing a book, but, that's the truth. I do think you're correct that a lot of Americans see Pearl Harbor and Midway as sort of the bookends, and that, Midway, done, right? We've turned the tide at this point.
Like justice for Pearl Harbor, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. We've wreaked our revenge, and the truth is that Midway in and of itself doesn't win the war. It doesn't even really set the war on a new trajectory. What it does is it allows the Americans to get out of this defensive crouch that they've been in for the past 6 months and begin thinking about, how do we want to rejigger this war? Where do we want to counterattack in this war? And that sets in motion the whole Guadalcanal campaign, which is just hugely important.
But also, it's understandable, isn't it? Every country does this with certain military victories. I mean, even the British, we do it with military defeats. I mean, the Dunkirk evacuation was essentially a failure, but we've transformed it into a moral victory. It's what countries do.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. And actually, one of the myths that we'll talk about here in just a little bit, this particular battle fits very well into sort of the whole American self-mythos, if you will. We love stories about, the plucky settlers are surrounded by, the hostile Indians, and then at the last moment, the cavalry comes in and saves the day. There's very much that whole vibe is going on at Midway as well. That we get this climactic dive bomber attack at supposedly the last minute. It's just beautiful from an American myth making standpoint.
Okay, let's move on to Midway myth number 3. This is a key moment in the battle. This is about the scout plane from Japanese cruiser Tone 4. Just
Yep.
tell us about this, John.
Okay, so during the morning at 04:30, Nagumo launches his main strike that's going to go down and attack the island of Midway, and he also launches 7 scout planes that are going to be fanning out to his eastern flank and kind of guarding his force against the possibility of any Americans out there. One of these planes, Tone's number 4 scout plane, ends up launching about a half an hour late, and nobody still knows why. There was a screw up on the catapult of some sort, and people are like, well, what's the problem? Just launch another plane, or, well, understand that we're launching these planes with black powder charges, like 50 pounds worth of black powder. And if there's a screw up on the catapult, you're going to be kind of gingerly about, kind of going out and investigating exactly what's going on. Anyway, this poor guy goes off a half an hour late. His name is Amari. And it's going to be this guy who's going to end up actually finding the Americans at around 07:45. And a lot of people have looked at this dude and they're like, if that guy hadn't been launched a half an hour late, Nagumo would have found the Americans a half an hour earlier and would have, changed everything. And the truth is that if you look at the route that Amari was supposed to fly that morning, and then where he actually ends up detecting the Americans, we don't know what happened there either, but he was not flying his actual preordained route. He either knew that he was late, and so he's like, I'm just going to fly right up the middle of my search wedge, or he was hot dogging it. Nobody knows, because he didn't survive the war, and none of his crew did either. But the result is that had he flown his route correctly, he actually would have ended up detecting the Americans 45 minutes later than he actually historically did. So the fact that he screwed up his flying somehow and then ends up detecting the Americans when he did was actually sort of the first bit of good luck that Nagumo had gotten from his scout planes all morning long. So again, a complete reversal of what the myth had been for 60 odd years.
That is fascinating. I mean, let's just say, though, and I know this is proper alternative history, but this is what we love doing on this channel. Let's say he had discovered the Americans half an hour earlier, as the myth suggests. What impact would that have had?
Actually, and let's broaden that a little bit, because there was a scout plane that should have detected the Americans at around 06:15 or so, and that was Chikuma's number 1 scout plane, which was flying the route just to the north of what Amari was doing. Nobody knows what went on with that plane either, but he was in a position that he should have detected one of the American task forces around that time. So he was either flying above the clouds, or again screwed up his navigation, or hot dogged his route. Nobody knows, but he missed that opportunity. Had he been able to find them at that time, it is barely possible that Nagumo might have been able to get a strike up in the air that might have been able to preempt some of the American launch cycle to get their planes up in the air. So that is a real potential zinger for the Americans, that could have actually materially changed the tide of the battle, because once you get beyond about 06:20, 06:30, the American, there's no way that you could physically fly a group of planes to the Americans in time to preempt their upcoming launches. So that bird has flown is kind of what it comes down to. So the fact that that guy screwed things up, kind of a big deal.
Okay, let's move on to Midway myth number 4. This is another example of potentially Americans trying to make Midway seem even more, I don't know if glamorous is the word, but hype it up a bit, which again, as I say, you understand. I mean, we Brits do it all the time too with our military successes. And this is around the sacrifice of the American torpedo plane squadrons. And they did make sacrifices, but tell us about this myth.
Yeah. So the very first planes that end up attacking the Japanese from our carriers is a group of torpedo planes from the carrier Hornet, VT-8. And they come in, 15 aircraft, 15 planes get shot down, and there's only one guy left alive in the water. They're massacred and accomplish nothing. One of them launches one torpedo that misses the carrier Soryu. And that's just the beginning, because then there's another squadron, VT6, that comes in at 0940, just a little bit later. Same general treatment. 10 of 14 planes get shot down or something like that. I mean, again, a real bloodbath, no results whatsoever. But down through the years, the Americans have always said, well, yeah, this was tragic and awful, but the fact that those planes attacked at low level meant that it pulled the Japanese combat air patrol Zeros down to sea level, which meant that then the way was open for the American dive bombers to come in at 1020. There was no opposition over the carrier fleet. That's a beautiful story, and it's baloney. And the reason it's baloney is because of the performance characteristics of the Mitsubishi Zero, which can climb from sea level up to 15,000 feet in 7.5 minutes or something like that. So the fact that VT-8 had been completely destroyed by about 0937, and this dive bomber attack we're talking about doesn't come in until 1020, those Zeros had plenty of time to get back up to, appropriate operating altitude. Same thing with VT-6, they got plenty of time. What really ends up happening is the final package of torpedo planes is from Yorktown, VT-3. They come in, they get spotted by the Japanese at about 10:10 in the morning. This is 10 minutes before that dive bomber attack. And the Japanese combat air patrol sort of, over focuses on these torpedo planes, and they all get sucked into this southeast threat vector where the torpedo planes are coming in. And the result is that it's not so much a question of altitude, it's lateral distortion. It's the fact that VT-3 is, just sucking all the oxygen out of the room, if you will. All of the cap Zeros are going down there, which means that then the other dive bombers that are approaching from orthogonal angles from the northeast and the southwest, while the Japanese are busy down in this quadrant, that's what really leaves the fleet open. But you can see why we would make this myth, right? Because nobody wants to look a mother or a wife in the eye and tell them your husband or your son died to no effect, right? Their lives were squandered. So we invent something where they actually did something practical in the course of the battle. The truth is they did do something practical, it's just not as glamorous. What they did is they took time off the clock. Because all this time, that these dribs and drabs of attacks are coming in. Nagumo wants to spot his decks with aircraft to hit back against the Americans, and he can't do it because he's under attack. So they took time off the clock, and that means that when the dive bombers do finally come in, Nagumo's in no position to resist that final attack.
Okay, let's come on to your fifth and final Midway myth, John. This is a big one. It's known as the flight deck myth. Just tell us about this.
Yeah, so when I was growing up as a kid, the myth was always that at the time those dive bombers come down at 1020, the Japanese flight decks were just chock-a-block with planes that were this close to being ready to take off and counterpunch against the Americans and knock our lights out. 4 deck loads of planes, right? The truth of the matter is that when those American dive bombers came down, the Japanese were nowhere near ready to launch that counterattack. And in fact, their flight decks were mostly empty. The only aircraft that were up there on a couple of those flight decks were some additional combat air patrol Zeros. This myth comes to us from Mitsuo Fuchida, who was the air group leader on the Akagi and also the flight leader at Pearl Harbor. He gave us another myth at Pearl Harbor too, around the fuel tanks, and I'll just leave that as a teaser there for some future episode. But basically, what Fuchida says is, we were ready to go, and the reason we know that Fuchida is full of it is that we have the Japanese Air Group records, and that was sort of the core of the book that Tony and I did. So just a quick primer on how you get a strike up on a flight deck and ready to rock and roll. What you have to do is you got to pull these planes out of the hangars one by one, put them up on the flight deck, an elevator at a time, get them lined up. Then you got to warm up their engines, because these are all radial aircraft engines. And you don't distribute the oil in the cylinders and then you try to apply full military power on takeoff, the engine goes kerblooey and you end up in the drink, and it's just bad. So if you go through the sort of the Gantt chart of all the things you got to do to get a strike ready to go, from the time Nagumo says go to the time when I can start launching is probably about 40 minutes. And during that time, the aft end of my flight deck is completely shut down because I'm putting aircraft back there and getting them ready to rock and roll, which means I cannot be landing any aircraft during this time, right? If I look at the Air Group records, though, what you'll see is that on the Akagi, for instance, just 10 minutes before that fatal dive bomber attack, Akagi lands a group of 3 fighters on her flight deck. And so right there, just from a pure mathematics standpoint, 10 minutes no equal to 40 minutes. The math just doesn't work. So why is Fuchida lying about that? Well, the reason he's lying about that is because if you lose 4 aircraft carriers in the course of a day, and you now have to go back to Tokyo, there's a little explaining that has to go on here, So someone's got to explain, how did this happen? And I look at Fuchida as being sort of the front man of a loose cabal of First Air Fleet officers who have this sort of informally agreed upon narrative around the battle, which goes roughly, we were this close, and then the gods of war came down and took it all away from us, as opposed to, that guy screwed up, and that guy screwed up, and that guy screwed up. And conveniently, too, then after the war, this myth sort of morphs even a little bit further to pin the blame on Nagumo and pin the blame on Yamamoto, who are both conveniently dead by this time, right? So Fuchida comes out with his book in 1952 with this myth in it, and it sort of has, in a business sense, you would call it first mover advantage, right? He gets this book out there. It's published. It gets translated into English. It's one of the most important English language sources from the Japanese side that we use. And so Fuchida's account, in essence, freezes American scholarship on this battle in place for 65 years. So quite an impressive achievement. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. John, this has been fascinating. We could talk for hours. We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for busting those 5 Midway myths for us. Just before we go, a couple of things to mention. First of all, you and I and Dr. Chris Parry did a full analysis of the Battle of Midway, and we unpicked what might have happened had things panned out differently and what the long-term consequences would have been a few weeks back. So we'll put a link to that video in the description. Check that out if you haven't watched it. Just finally, is there a real fact about the Battle of Midway that is lesser known that you want more people to be aware of?
Yeah. Another sort of mini myth is that the Japanese carrier aviation force was wiped out at Midway. The truth is that they probably brought almost 400 aviators with them to that battle. Only 110 actually die. And so it's really the Battle of Santa Cruz later in the year that kills 148 of those carrier aviators that could be seen as the real sort of death knell for their aviation corps.
Brilliant. John, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us, the great Jonathan Parshall there. And we will be back busting more historical myths very soon. If there's anything you want to see us deconstruct, let us know in the comments below. And remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel, History Undone with James Hanson. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.